It was a Saturday afternoon, and the Johnson family was looking forward to a simple outing. Michael Johnson, a man in his mid-40s, had spent most of the week working long hours at his construction job, overseeing projects that often took him away from home. His wife, Angela, had been managing their small family-run cleaning service, and though the business was thriving, it still left her feeling tired at the end of the day. They had 2 children, Marcus and Maya, both teenagers, who often found themselves buried in their phones or schoolwork. But today, they decided, would be different. Today, they would put away their distractions and enjoy a family meal at a restaurant in the heart of their small town. They hadn't gone out to eat as a family in months, and the prospect of a delicious meal together felt like a welcome escape from the monotony of daily life. Angela had heard about a new spot in town, the Oak Bistro, rumored to have an inviting atmosphere and a diverse menu. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was local, cozy, and had good reviews. Michael, always the planner, decided they'd go there, knowing it would be a nice treat for everyone. As they entered the restaurant, the warm glow of the lights and the rustic charm of the interior immediately made them feel comfortable. The aroma of freshly prepared food lingered in the air. A young woman greeted them at the door, her smile welcoming. "Welcome to the Oak Bistro. How many for dinner tonight?" she asked. Michael smiled back. "4, please," he said. She led them to a booth near the window, where they could see the small town bustling outside, life moving at a slower pace. It felt good to be away from the daily grind, even if just for an evening. The menu was diverse, offering everything from comfort food to a few adventurous dishes. Michael's eyes landed on the grilled salmon, Angela on a vegetable stir-fry, Marcus was eyeing a massive burger, and Maya, ever the adventurous eater, was leaning toward a pasta dish she hadn't tried before. The waitress took their orders, and they settled in, chatting amongst themselves, enjoying the moment. For a while, everything felt normal, peaceful. But that sense of comfort was soon shattered when their food arrived. The waitress, a man in his late 20s with a sharp expression, set the dishes down on their table without much ceremony. As he placed Angela's stir-fry in front of her, he gave her a dismissive glance. She didn't think much of it at first, after all, people sometimes get busy. But as the man moved on to Michael's plate of grilled salmon, she noticed something strange. He stared at the family for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze lingering uncomfortably. His lips barely moved as he mumbled, "There you go, enjoy," with a tone that sounded more sarcastic than kind. Angela frowned, but Michael didn't notice. He was engrossed in conversation with Marcus about an upcoming project at work. The moment passed, but something about it felt off, and Angela couldn't shake the feeling that it had been intentional. As they dug into their meals, the atmosphere at the table began to change. The food wasn't bad, but it wasn't as great as the reviews had promised. Angela had expected better from a place with such high praise, and she found herself more distracted by the odd behavior of the waiter than enjoying her stir-fry. As Michael continued to talk, she couldn't help but notice that the waiter was lingering by the bar, casting sideways glances at their table. He seemed to be watching them, his eyes hard, calculating. But what happened next was the real turning point. Just as the family was finishing their meal, the waiter returned, this time carrying the check. He placed it on the table without a word. As he turned to leave, he paused, looked over his shoulder, and without a hint of shame, muttered under his breath, "Should have known it was too good to be true, a family like yours eating here." The words hit like a slap across the face. Angela felt the blood drain from her face. Marcus and Maya looked up, confused by the waiter's sudden departure. Michael, who had been paying attention to his phone, turned to see Angela's shocked expression. His face tightened in anger. "Did you hear that?" Angela whispered, her voice trembling. Michael didn't answer immediately, but his expression darkened when he pieced together what had just happened. The waiter was already far enough away that he didn't seem to notice the family's reaction, but Angela's mind was racing. She had lived through enough subtle discrimination in her life to know when it was happening. But this? This was different. This was blatant. The way he had dismissed them, the way he'd looked at them as if they didn't belong here, as if they were beneath him, it was as if their presence in the restaurant had somehow violated some unspoken rule. Marcus, usually the quieter of the two children, looked up at his father, his brow furrowed. "Dad? What's going on?" he asked. Maya, sensing the tension, remained silent but looked back and forth between her parents, her face puzzled. Michael, now fully aware of what had just happened, slammed his hand onto the table, making the silverware clink sharply. "I'm going to go talk to him," Michael said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "No," Angela said, grabbing his arm. "Don't. Let's just leave." But Michael was already standing up. His patience had worn thin. He marched towards the bar, where the waiter was chatting with a colleague. The confrontation was swift, sharp, and full of emotion. Michael asked him about his comment, calling out the disrespect he had just witnessed. The waiter, initially defensive, quickly became dismissive and rude. He denied making any comment and suggested that Michael was just being sensitive. It wasn't worth getting into further, Michael realized, but the damage had been done. He turned around, walked back to the table, and sat down with a stiff posture. Angela had already started gathering her purse, her hand trembling as she placed a tip on the table, though it was clear from the expression on her face that she didn't want to leave any tip at all. Marcus stood up as well, his face flushed with frustration. The air between them had changed. This was no longer a simple family outing. It had become an incident, an affront that had shaken them to their core. As they left the restaurant, the cool night air did little to calm their emotions. They didn't say much during the drive home. Angela kept glancing at Michael, who was gritting his teeth, his mind racing. How could something like this still happen? In a place like this? With everything they'd worked for, everything they'd overcome as a family, how could a stranger degrade them so casually, so arrogantly? That night, the Johnson family's lives changed. They didn't know it at the time, but the seeds of something greater were planted in that moment. They would walk away from that restaurant, but not in defeat. No, they would walk away with a fire in their hearts, a fire that would ignite a chain of events that would not only change their lives forever, but their town as well. This was just the beginning. Outspoken, had started questioning the fairness of the world around her, something that had never crossed her mind before. The conversation at the dinner table that night was unlike anything the family had ever experienced. Michael, usually the level-headed one, was the first to speak. "We can't just let this go," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "I've been thinking about it all week. We can't just walk away from this. If we do, it's like we're accepting that kind of treatment." Angela didn't say anything at first. She knew where Michael was headed, but she wasn't sure how to respond. She had always been the one to encourage peaceful resolution, to let things slide for the sake of harmony. But this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. This was something more. "I don't know, Michael," she said, her voice softer now, tinged with uncertainty. "Maybe it's best to just let it go. We've got enough on our plates with the business and the kids. Do we really want to stir things up more?" Michael met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "If we let it go, we're teaching Marcus and Maya that it's okay for people to treat us this way. That it's okay for people to think they can look down on us. I don't want them to grow up thinking that's normal." The words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Angela's heart ached as she realized that Michael was right. She didn't want their children to feel like their worth was determined by others' prejudices. But she also knew that taking action could have consequences. What if it made things worse? What if the town turned against them? The idea of confrontation was daunting, especially for someone like her who preferred peace over conflict. For days, the family avoided the subject. They tried to go back to their routine, but the undercurrent of tension never truly disappeared. They would sit down for dinner, eat in silence, and then go to bed, each of them turning over the events in their minds. Michael couldn't help but feel the growing frustration within himself. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to solve problems, to face challenges head-on. But this was something different. This wasn't just a personal issue, it was a matter of principle. He had worked hard his whole life to build a good reputation, to be known as a man of integrity. He couldn't stand the thought of being diminished by someone else's prejudice. Angela, too, found herself grappling with the situation. She'd never been one to back down from a challenge, but she also understood the potential risks of making waves. Their small cleaning business had brought them some stability, but they weren't rich. They didn't have the kind of financial cushion that would allow them to weather a public backlash. But even as she weighed the risks, she couldn't shake the feeling that doing nothing would be a betrayal of everything they stood for. The Johnsons dove into the idea of opening their own restaurant with a fervor that surprised even themselves. They knew it wouldn't be easy, there were so many hurdles ahead. Michael and Angela spent long hours researching the restaurant business, talking to anyone they knew who could offer advice, and figuring out how they could make it happen. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they had the determination of people who had already been knocked down by life and were no longer afraid to stand up and fight. Every night, after they'd put Marcus and Maya to bed, they'd sit down together at the kitchen table, mapping out their vision for the restaurant. They had a name picked out, Roots and Rebound, symbolic of where they had come from and how they had risen up from the injustice they'd faced. The name wasn't just a title, it was a reminder of who they were and what they had to offer. The process of securing a location was their first major challenge. They needed something affordable, but also in a good spot, somewhere with enough foot traffic but not too much competition. After weeks of searching, they found a small, run-down space on the outskirts of town. It was far from ideal, but it was affordable, and it had the bones to be something special with the right vision. The building had a history, but it had been abandoned for years, slowly fading into obscurity. To most people, it was just another forgotten property, but to the Johnsons, it was a blank canvas, a chance to take something neglected and turn it into a thriving symbol of resilience. The renovations began immediately, with Michael using his experience as a contractor to oversee the repairs himself. He spent days stripping away the old wallpaper, patching holes, and refinishing floors. It wasn't glamorous work, but it felt necessary. Angela, who had always handled the business side of things for their cleaning company, took charge of the logistics. She handled everything from securing permits to hiring a small team of workers, most of whom were people they knew from the community. Marcus and Maya, though initially skeptical about the whole idea, soon found themselves helping out in their own ways. Marcus, who had always been interested in food, started experimenting with recipes in his free time, while Maya, with her natural knack for organization, helped Angela with paperwork and marketing. The opening day loomed closer, and with it came a growing sense of anticipation and anxiety. Michael and Angela had poured everything they had into this restaurant, and while they were excited, they couldn't help but feel the weight of the risk they were taking. They had spent years building their cleaning business, and they were putting it all on the line for this new venture. What if it failed? What if people didn't show up? What if their community didn't embrace them the way they hoped? Angela tried to push these fears aside. "We've worked hard for this," she reminded herself. "We've got this." As the final touches were put on the restaurant, word began to spread. The buzz in the town was palpable. People who had known Michael and Angela for years, through their cleaning business and their involvement in the community, started talking. Some were excited. They had heard the whispers of what had happened at the Oak Bistro, and now they were curious about what the Johnsons were creating. Others were skeptical. The town had its fair share of established restaurants, many of which had been around for decades. Was this new place going to last? Was it just another flash-in-the-pan idea, or was it something special? The day of the grand opening arrived. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that felt like new beginnings. Michael and Angela stood outside the restaurant, their hearts racing as they watched people trickle in. They had prepared for this day for months, and now it was finally happening. People from the town, some familiar faces, and others curious strangers, lined up outside the door, eager to get a taste of what Roots and Rebound had to offer. Inside, the restaurant was warm and inviting. The decor was simple but elegant, with touches of family history scattered throughout, old photographs, family heirlooms, and memories of a journey that had led them here. The atmosphere was unlike anything the town had seen before, modern, yet grounded in the sense of community that made the Johnsons who they were. The menu reflected that same spirit, featuring comfort food with a twist, dishes inspired by Michael's childhood, Angela's favorite recipes, and even some that Marcus had perfected in his spare time. As the doors opened, customers flooded in, eager to try the food. The Johnsons worked tirelessly behind the scenes, ensuring everything went smoothly. It was overwhelming at first. There were hiccups, a few mistakes in the kitchen, and moments where it seemed like the pressure might break them. But every time they looked up, they saw a table full of smiling faces, people from their town, people they had known for years, enjoying the food they had worked so hard to perfect. Word spread fast. By the end of the first week, the restaurant was busier than they had anticipated. The community was rallying behind them, and every day brought in more customers. Angela had spent weeks making connections, handing out flyers, and reaching out to people through social media, and it was starting to pay off. The people who had doubted them, the ones who had questioned their decision, were slowly starting to come around. They saw what Michael and Angela were doing. It wasn't just about serving good food, it was about standing up for something greater. It was about creating a space where everyone felt welcome, a place that wasn't defined by old prejudices but by the strength of the people who built it. But just as things were starting to settle into a rhythm, a challenge emerged. The Oak Bistro, the restaurant that had started it all, began to feel the impact of the competition. Their business had slowed, and rumors began circulating that the manager had been getting pressure from the community about the incident with the Johnsons. The Oak Bistro, once a staple in the town, was no longer the place to be. Customers who had once been loyal to it began drifting away, many of them showing up at Roots and Rebound instead. Some said it was because of the food, because Michael and Angela had truly created something special. But others whispered that it was a form of quiet retribution, a way of supporting the Johnsons' stand against the disrespect they had endured. It wasn't long before the owner of the Oak Bistro approached Michael. The encounter was awkward, charged with the kind of tension that only time could resolve. The man, visibly uncomfortable, tried to extend an olive branch. He apologized for the waiter's behavior, admitting that he had heard the complaints and that it shouldn't have happened. He even mentioned that he had spoken with the waiter, who had been fired in the wake of the incident. Michael, however, wasn't interested in the apology, not because he was unwilling to forgive, but because the damage had already been done. It wasn't just about one person's mistake, it was about a system that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. "I appreciate the apology," Michael said quietly, "but it's not about that anymore. It's about making sure this town knows we're not going to stand for disrespect. We're not going to stand for being treated like we don't belong." The conversation ended quickly after that, with the owner retreating, unsure of how to proceed. But for Michael, it wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. And in that moment, he realized that the restaurant wasn't just a business. It was a symbol. A symbol of their determination, of their resilience, and of their refusal to accept anything less than respect. Roots and Rebound was more than just a place to eat. It was a statement. And it was only just beginning. The weeks following the opening of Roots and Rebound were a whirlwind of activity. The Johnsons, overwhelmed but invigorated, poured everything they had into making their restaurant a success. The community's response had been overwhelmingly positive, with many coming back time and time again, eager to support the Johnsons and their vision. For Michael and Angela, the hard work was beginning to pay off. Yet, despite the growing success of their restaurant, there was an undercurrent of tension that neither could ignore. It wasn't just about the customers or the business, it was about the impact they were having on the town as a whole. Word of the Johnsons' success had spread, and with it, came a mixture of admiration and resentment. People who had once doubted them now spoke of their resilience and drive. But there were others who saw their rise as a challenge to the status quo, a reminder that things could change, that the old ways of thinking could no longer be accepted. Michael noticed it in the way some people looked at him when he walked into town, the murmurs that followed when he visited other businesses. He wasn't just the owner of a new restaurant, he had become a symbol of resistance, of someone who had turned an insult into an empire. And as his success grew, so did the pressure on him to continue living up to that image. Angela, too, felt the weight of their newfound status. She was the quieter of the two, the one who preferred to stay behind the scenes, but as the restaurant's reputation grew, so did her role. She found herself attending meetings with local business owners, navigating the complex web of small-town politics, and figuring out how to balance the demands of their growing restaurant with the needs of their family. It was a delicate dance, one that often left her exhausted, but also proud. She had never imagined that their little restaurant would become the talk of the town, a beacon of hope for those who felt overlooked or underestimated. But there were times when the pressure to maintain that success, to continue proving that they belonged in this world, felt suffocating. Their children, too, were affected by the transformation. Marcus, once a quiet and introspective teenager, had found a new sense of purpose in the restaurant. He spent hours experimenting with recipes, coming up with new ideas for dishes, and contributing in ways that surprised even himself. He had always been a bright kid, but the restaurant gave him a platform to showcase his talents, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly seen. Maya, on the other hand, had taken on more responsibility as the restaurant's unofficial manager. She was often the first one in and the last one out, helping with everything from customer service to scheduling. Both children, who had once been skeptical of their parents' dream, now saw it as something they could be a part of. It wasn't just a family business anymore, it was a family legacy, something that would define their future. But with success came challenges, some of which Michael and Angela had never anticipated. There were moments of doubt when things weren't going as smoothly as they had hoped. The restaurant business, they quickly learned, was a brutal one. It was not enough to have a great product and a loyal customer base, they needed to stay ahead of the curve, to anticipate the changing demands of the market, and to constantly innovate. There were nights when the kitchen was understaffed, when they ran out of ingredients, when the line grew longer than they could handle. There were also moments of personal strain, arguments about finances, disagreements about the direction of the business, and the ever-present stress of trying to maintain a work-life balance. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Angela sat down at the kitchen table, her face drawn with exhaustion. Michael, who had been busy in the restaurant's back office, walked in and paused when he saw her. He could tell that something was off. The bright spark that had once lit up her face seemed dimmed, and her shoulders were heavy with the weight of everything they had been carrying. She hadn't said anything, but he knew. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with concern. Angela hesitated, then let out a deep sigh. "I don't know, Michael. I'm just tired. We're doing well, but I feel like we're always running. There's never a moment to breathe. Every day feels like we're climbing a mountain, and the higher we get, the harder it becomes." Michael sat down beside her, his brow furrowed. He understood what she meant. The initial thrill of their success had faded into the reality of constant work. The pressure to keep up, to outdo themselves, was wearing them both down. But as he looked at her, he realized something deeper. The reason this was so exhausting wasn't just because of the physical demands of the business. It was because, in a way, they were still fighting. They weren't just running a restaurant, they were proving a point. Every plate of food, every customer who walked through the door, every bit of success, they were doing it to show that they were more than what the world had expected of them. They were doing it to prove that their worth wasn't determined by others' prejudices, but by their own ability to rise above. He reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We've come so far already. We've built this from nothing. I know it's hard, but we've got each other. We can keep going. We just need to remember why we're doing this." Angela nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She knew they had to keep pushing forward, but the idea of constantly fighting for their place in the world was starting to wear on her. The emotional toll of it all was something neither of them had fully prepared for. As the months passed, the success of Roots and Rebound continued to grow. They started receiving recognition in the local press, with stories about their rise from adversity to triumph. Their restaurant became a symbol of perseverance, of turning pain into purpose. But with the attention came new challenges. The town, once a place of familiarity and comfort, had begun to change in ways they hadn't anticipated. Some people who had once supported them now began to question their success, wondering if it had been too easy, too sudden. There were whispers that Michael and Angela had been lucky, that their rise had been more about timing than talent. But despite the murmurs of doubt, the Johnsons refused to let it shake them. They had built something from nothing, and that in itself was something to be proud of. Every day, they continued to show up, to push through the doubts and the challenges, because they knew that their success wasn't just about the restaurant, it was about proving that their community could be better, that people could rise above the labels and stereotypes that had once confined them. But as time went on, the tension between the old guard and the new wave continued to grow. Some of the more established businesses in town began to feel the impact of Roots and Rebound success. The Oak Bistro, still struggling to recover from the scandal surrounding the Johnsons' original confrontation with the waiter, found itself losing more and more customers. The owner, once proud of his establishment, began to see the cracks in his business. His restaurant, once a staple of the community, was slowly becoming irrelevant, while the Johnson success seemed to grow with each passing day. But the more successful Roots and Rebound became, the more determined Michael and Angela were to prove that it wasn't just about getting even, it was about changing the narrative. It was about showing that, despite all odds, they had built something that would outlast the resentment, the prejudice, and the doubts. Their story was not just one of revenge, it was one of hope, perseverance, and the power of a dream that refused to die. And as Roots and Rebound continued to thrive, the town began to change in ways they hadn't expected. The lines between the old guard and the new were blurring, and the Johnsons were at the center of it all, a living testament to the fact that with enough heart, enough determination, and enough courage, anything. The relentless momentum of Roots and Rebound was undeniable. Michael and Angela had created something that was bigger than a restaurant, it was an idea, a movement. Their commitment to offering not only delicious food but also a space where people felt valued and included had sparked a broader transformation. The town, once divided by old prejudices, was beginning to evolve, albeit in subtle ways. Conversations that had once been hush-hushed in corners or avoided altogether were now happening openly. People who had spent years in separate social circles, barely acknowledging each other's existence, were now finding common ground through the Johnsons' restaurant. In many ways, their success had begun to stitch the town together, making it stronger, more united. However, with growth came new complications. The Johnsons soon realized that being the heart of a cultural shift wasn't as simple as it seemed. It came with its own set of challenges, often ones they hadn't anticipated. For instance, as the restaurant gained more fame, the demand for a larger space became undeniable. The small, humble restaurant that had served as their foundation quickly outgrew itself. They had always intended for Roots and Rebound to be a family-focused establishment, a local gathering place, but now it was on the map, attracting attention not only from the community but from neighboring towns as well. The question of whether they should expand their operation loomed larger every day. Michael, who had always been a hands-on person, was hesitant. The idea of losing the personal touch that had made the restaurant so special was something he feared. Angela, on the other hand, saw the potential for growth not just in terms of profit but in their ability to reach even more people, to continue using their success as a platform for spreading messages of unity and resilience. They had a chance to create something that could outlast them, a legacy that could truly change the community and the way people thought. Still, the decision wasn't easy, and it was one that required weeks of careful thought and debate. Every night, after their children had gone to bed, Michael and Angela would sit together at the kitchen table, weighing the pros and cons, trying to figure out what was best for the business and the family. But just as the Johnsons were contemplating expansion, another unexpected turn of events shook their world. Word had spread about the success of Roots and Rebound to people far beyond the town's borders, and soon, they began to receive offers from investors eager to get involved. Some of the offers were flattering, even tempting. These investors promised substantial capital, the resources for a much-needed expansion, and even the possibility of taking Roots and Rebound to other cities. The thought of becoming a larger, more influential force was both exciting and intimidating. But Michael and Angela were cautious. They had worked too hard to build what they had, and the idea of surrendering even a small portion of control to outsiders made them uneasy. As the pressure mounted, the cracks in their personal life began to show. Both Michael and Angela were stretched thin, dealing with the challenges of running a growing business, managing their family life, and maintaining their own mental and emotional health. The weight of all of it began to wear them down, and their relationship, once a solid foundation for everything, began to feel strained. The constant stress of making the right decision, whether it was about business or personal matters, created a distance between them that neither of them had expected. One evening, after another intense day at the restaurant, Angela walked into their living room, her face weary but determined. She had made a decision. "Michael, we need to talk. I can't keep doing this. We're getting pulled in too many directions. The business, the kids, the stress, it's too much. I need you, and I need us to be okay." Michael, who had been pacing back and forth, stopped. He hadn't realized how much his focus on the restaurant had taken a toll on their relationship. "I didn't mean for it to get like this, Angela," he said, his voice low, tinged with regret. "But we're so close. Everything we've worked for is right there. I can't just step away from it now." Angela shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's not just the business. It's us. I've been so focused on keeping everything together that I forgot about us. We're not just partners in the restaurant, we're partners in life. And I don't want to lose that." The conversation was a turning point for them both. It was clear that something needed to change. The stress of managing a rapidly growing business had taken more of a toll on their family life than they had realized. It wasn't just about the restaurant anymore, it was about their marriage, their children, and finding a balance between their professional and personal lives. After that night, they made a pact to prioritize their relationship and their family. They began setting boundaries, taking time off, and rediscovering the reasons they had started the restaurant in the first place, because they wanted to create something that not only made a difference in the community but also allowed them to build a life together. Just as they found a new rhythm, another unexpected event forced them to confront the reality of their success. The town was buzzing with talk about Roots and Rebound's growing popularity. There was no denying that the Johnsons had become local legends, symbols of resilience and entrepreneurial spirit. But as the attention increased, so did the scrutiny. Not everyone was thrilled about their success. In fact, there were whispers behind closed doors, especially among the more established members of the town. Some people resented the idea that a family with such humble beginnings could come in and disrupt the status quo. One day, the owner of the Oak Bistro, the restaurant that had once been their rival, approached Michael once more. This time, there was no apology, no awkward attempt at reconciliation. Instead, the man came with an ultimatum: the Johnsons had to tone down their success or risk further conflict. The idea of competition in a small town had always been an unspoken rule, one that kept things stable, even predictable. The Oak Bistro, struggling to stay afloat, was now being overshadowed by Roots and Rebound's meteoric rise, and some of the town's most influential figures were beginning to show signs of discomfort. Michael was taken aback. This was not a fight he had expected to have. He had thought that his success would speak for itself, that the community would rally around him, not out of revenge or bitterness, but out of mutual respect for what he and his family had accomplished. But now, it was clear that not everyone felt that way. The request to step back, to dim the light that had shone so brightly, was a challenge he hadn't prepared for. He turned to Angela for advice. They sat in the quiet of their restaurant late one evening, the bustling noise of the kitchen fading into the background. "What do we do now?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Angela thought for a moment, then looked up at him. "We keep going. We didn't build this restaurant for anyone else. We did it for our family, for our community, and because we believed in something bigger than us. If some people can't handle that, then that's on them. We've already won. We've shown the world that they can't control our destiny." With that, Michael and Angela made the decision to stand firm. They would not dim their light, not for anyone. The idea of changing who they were or scaling back to make others feel comfortable wasn't even a consideration. They had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, and come too far to allow fear or resentment to define their future. Roots and Rebound continued to grow, as did its impact. The restaurant wasn't just about great food or a successful business, it had become a beacon of what was possible when you refused to back down, when you refused to accept anything less than what you deserve. The story of Michael and Angela Johnson was more than just the tale of a family overcoming adversity, it was a story of a community coming together, of rising above, of rejecting hate and prejudice in favor of something better. They had turned a single moment of insult into a foundation for an empire, one built not on revenge, but on love, resilience, and the unshakable belief that anything is possible when you fight for what you believe in. As the years passed, Roots and Rebound continued to thrive, its reputation expanding far beyond the borders of their small town. Michael and Angela Johnson had achieved something extraordinary, but they quickly realized that their journey was far from over. The restaurant was not just a successful business, it had become a symbol of defiance, a testament to the power of resilience and the unyielding spirit of the human heart. The community, once divided, was now coming together in ways they never thought possible. It wasn't just the food that kept people coming back to Roots and Rebound, it was the message. The restaurant had become a gathering place, where conversations about race, community, and identity could be had openly and without fear. People of all walks of life found themselves in the same room, breaking bread and sharing stories, united by a common cause. But even in the face of all their success, the Johnsons knew that the road ahead would not always be smooth. As the restaurant continued to grow, so did the expectations placed on them. They had set the bar so high that there was little room for error. And as their story continued to make headlines, the pressure to maintain their reputation weighed heavily on Michael and Angela. They had built something from nothing, and now they had to prove that they could keep it alive, that their success wasn't just a flash in the pan. They were no longer just the owners of a restaurant, they were role models, figures of inspiration to people who saw them as living proof that change was possible. The media attention was both a blessing and a curse. While it brought in new customers and increased their visibility, it also opened them up to a level of scrutiny that they had never experienced before. Every move they made was under a microscope. Every decision, no matter how small, was dissected and analyzed. Michael and Angela were used to hard work, but this was a different kind of pressure. They found themselves constantly balancing the demands of the business with the need to protect their family's privacy. There were days when they longed for the simplicity of the past, when their restaurant was just a dream, and their only worry was getting through the next shift. But that was no longer an option. The success of Roots and Rebound had changed their lives in ways they hadn't fully grasped when they first started. One day, as Michael sat in his office at the back of the restaurant, he found himself staring at the walls, wondering where the next chapter would take them. The decision to expand had been a difficult one, but now it seemed inevitable. They had outgrown their original space, and the demand for more locations was growing every day. He knew that expansion meant new challenges, new risks, and more pressure, but it also meant new opportunities to create something that could leave a lasting legacy. Roots and Rebound wasn't just about serving great food, it was about showing people that they could make a difference, no matter their circumstances. But as he sat there, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The thought of spreading themselves too thin, of losing the very essence of what had made Roots and Rebound so special, made him hesitate. Angela entered the office, her eyes tired but determined. "We can't keep waiting, Michael. The time for expansion is now. The restaurant has become a beacon, and we have a responsibility to carry that torch forward. We can't hold back because we're afraid of change." Michael looked up at her, his gaze conflicted. "I know you're right. But I'm not sure we can handle it. The last thing I want is to lose what we've built. This place, it's not just a business, it's our life. If we expand too quickly, we could lose everything." Angela smiled softly, understanding his fear. "We won't lose it, Michael. We've come this far because we've never let fear dictate our decisions. If we stay true to who we are, if we remember the heart of why we started this in the first place, then nothing will change. We're not just building a restaurant, we're building a movement." Her words gave him a sense of clarity, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent so much time worrying about the future that he had forgotten why they had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about the size of the business or how many locations they could open, it was about the people they were serving and the impact they were making. With that in mind, Michael made a decision. They would expand, but they would do it on their terms. They would remain true to their values, ensuring that the essence of Roots and Rebound would never be lost. As they began the process of opening new locations, the Johnsons took great care in selecting each new site. They chose areas where their message could have the most impact, places where the community could truly benefit from their presence. The new restaurants were not just about food, they were about creating a space for people to come together, to learn from each other, and to celebrate their shared humanity. Roots and Rebound had become more than just a business, it was a movement that transcended the walls of their restaurant. Meanwhile, back in their hometown, the Johnson success had begun to ripple through the community in ways they hadn't expected. The old divides between race, class, and status were slowly starting to fade. There were still challenges, of course, prejudices that ran deep and systems that were slow to change. But the example set by Michael and Angela was having a profound impact. People who had once been hesitant to mix with those they saw as different were now engaging in conversations, building bridges, and breaking down barriers. The town was evolving, and the Johnsons were at the forefront of that change. One day, as Michael walked through the newly opened location in a neighboring town, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was more than just a business, this was a legacy. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in. He thought back to the day when they had opened the doors of the original Roots and Rebound, when they had faced not only the challenges of starting a business but the weight of the racism and prejudice that had fueled their drive. They had faced adversity at every turn, but instead of being broken by it, they had turned it into something beautiful, something that would stand the test of time. As he stood in the new location, watching the staff interact with customers, Michael realized that the real success wasn't measured in profits or accolades, it was measured in the lives they had touched, the conversations they had sparked, and the change they had inspired. Roots and Rebound had become a place where people could come together, where they could share their stories and their experiences, and where they could begin to see each other as equals. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a catalyst for change. The expansion wasn't without its challenges. Each new location brought its own set of obstacles, different demographics, varying community dynamics, and logistical hurdles. But the Johnsons took it all in stride, knowing that their success was not just about the number of restaurants they owned, but about the difference they were making in the world. They had become more than just business owners, they had become leaders, educators, and advocates for a more inclusive and equitable society. As Michael and Angela stood together in one of the new locations, watching the bustle of customers and staff, they shared a quiet moment of reflection. The road had been long, filled with challenges and setbacks, but they had made it. They had turned a moment of pain into a legacy that would live on for generations. They had taken something that could have destroyed them and used it to build something beautiful, something that would continue to inspire people long after they were gone. Roots and Rebound was no longer just a restaurant, it was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, the power of resilience, and the importance of community. Michael and Angela had not only built a business, they had built a movement that would continue to shape the world for years to come. And as they looked ahead to the future, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would always stay true to their mission. They had started this journey with nothing but a dream, and now, that dream was a reality that had the power to change the world, one plate at a time.